Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. So, engagers, welcome once again to another episode of the Professor Game Podcast. And we have Kurt with us today. But before we kick off, Kurt, are you prepared to engage?
I am. I am very, very ready to engage.
Let's do this because we have Kurt with us today as a sought-after speaker and recognized leader in human motivation and behavior change. For over 20 years, he has worked with global companies to apply behavioral science principles to drive change in their organizations. And he is the founder and president of the Lantern Group, which is a communication and behavioral design agency. He's also the co-founder with Tim Holihan of the Behavioral Grooves podcast, so another podcaster today with us, where they interview leading academic and business executives from around the world and explore how they apply behavioral science to their work and their lives. So as you can see, he's also researching how to do, this whole behavioral science beyond his daily work as well, including, having guests on that podcast. And of course, all his work focuses on ways to positively influence how people behave. So Kurt, is there anything that we're leaving out this intro before we kick off?
It covers most of it, the most important pieces from that work perspective. So yes, we're good to go.
Cool. So we want to sort of see what is your daily life. We want to understand a little bit more about Kurt. So if we were to hang out with a day with you, or maybe a week, I don't know, wherever you want to go, what would being Kurt in a day like today, in a week like this one, look like? What does it feel like to be Kurt?
Yeah. So running a small agency and then having a podcast on the side takes up the vast majority of my days and most days, weekends, not always, but sometimes there as well. But mostly from the work perspective, right? It's working with clients. It's having phone calls. It's having discussions. It's trying to understand what the issue is and then trying to say, what are the behavioral science principles that we can apply? So most of that work is around employee engagement, employee motivation. So I do a lot of work with companies around incentive plans, around manager training to figure out how they're doing different things. And then the vast majority of that also then lends itself into communication. So how do you communicate that information to your teams or to your employees and various different aspects of that? So that can take a wide variety of different perspectives. It looks different for every company. One of the insights from behavioral science is that context matters. So the one organization versus another organization, what works in organization A doesn't necessarily work in organization B. And even inside of organizations, what works for one team doesn't necessarily work for another team. So lots of phone calls, lots of Zoom calls these days, lots of just then taking that and going back and working on that on the side. About 20% of my week is devoted to the podcast. So that's a whole separate piece. And that's probably my favorite part of the week because we get to talk with just fantastic people who are much, much more brighter than I am and learning from them. But then you got to prepare, all the podcast stuff. You prepare, you go and you find out what they've done and ask you to get your questions. And then my co-host and I do a follow-up piece in the post-production. We do the intros and different things in the post-production, but we also do what we call a grooving session, where we just, after we've done the interview, we go back, look at the transcripts, and then we pull out some key things and try to either take the academic talk that the researchers have brought in and make it more into just everyday talk, so it makes it applicable to what people are doing, or vice versa. If we're talking with a practitioner and they're talking about what they're doing, then we're trying to apply some of the behavioral science principles back in. So saying, hey, this is how we do this, and this is the principles that apply.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. I like the perspective as well of having those grooves in the Behavioral Grooves podcast. Very, very interesting. So, of course, I have to say, listening to these principles, it just makes me want to listen to that podcast, and I definitely will. And I'd like to invite the engagers as well to engage with that podcast. If this is something that interests you, definitely go over there. And Kurt, as you saw, because you've probably listened to at least one or more episodes of the podcast before, you had the questions in advance. We'd like to start sort of strong in a way. So we would like to know of one of those times, you were going north, things went south, what happened there. We want to be there in that story at the ground level, so to speak. We want to hear from you of a time where, behavioral science, in a way, led you to some sort of fail or first attempt in learning. So we want to be there with you and take those lessons away. So microphone's yours.
Yeah. And, it's like, which story do I tell here, right? So in honesty, right? The key piece from science, I think in general, is that you learn from your mistakes. And if you don't, then you get into these other aspects. And there's some behavioral biases that are known about that, and confirmation bias and motivated reasoning and a variety of others that are there. But a specific story. So working with a client, and they had a relatively large client. They had a sales force who they had an incentive program that they wanted us to look at to say, hey, people aren't necessarily very happy with this. What are some of the, what can we do? And so we went out and we do our due diligence, and we go and we interview salespeople, we interview their managers, we interview the leadership team that goes in there. Then we're trying to put this behavioral science lens on to try to understand what are some of the underlying motivational drives that are going in, and then come back with some recommendations. And what was interesting is that during the course of those interviews, what we ended up finding was that there were definitely some issues with the plan and how the plan was designed. But more importantly, there were issues with some of the interactions between the senior leadership team, in particular between the VP of marketing and the VP of sales. And they were sending conflicting messages to the organization and kind of having different camps. And so that kind of permeated the entirety of everything else that was going on, from how people were viewing their incentives and their work and what's the future going to hold. And there's a variety of different, again, motivational things that we're doing. And it was a really tough decision, because how are we, this wasn't what we were brought in to talk to the organization about. We were brought in to look at the incentive plan, not senior leadership interaction and interpersonal dynamics. And so, the failure here is that we waited, because we're going, well, we'll just, maybe it's not that big a deal, different pieces. And we finally got to a point where it just became so apparent. And then we finally had to raise this issue literally weeks before we're supposed to get the end result in. And we get brought in by the president. We had to fly out literally like the next, couple days afterwards to have this face-to-face meeting. And it didn't set that up properly from the perspective of, because they felt like they were being thrown under the bus, and that wasn't the case. It was really, we're trying to figure out how to make the employees more motivated and more engaged. And just this argument that they were having, this disagreement on the direction of the organization, was inhibiting that. We weren't trying to throw them under the bus. But anyway, that was the long story short of it. And I think if we would have handled it better up front when we first realized, maybe had one-off conversations with the leaders as opposed to going to the president, and variety of other learnings that you could take from that. So I think there's many sort of behavioral insights from that, both from what you were observing there, but also even from your reactions to the issue, right? So yeah. I don't know if you want to spend a minute or two, sort of commenting on that, on either or both. How do you feel about that? Because I'm sure you're as a scientist on this, and a behavioral designer as well, this is something that is definitely in your piece. So do you want to spend a couple of minutes on that? It is. Well, what the interesting piece is, in retrospect, looking back at how fearful I was, right? The fear of bringing this topic up, when in fact, once it got brought up, so again, the learning from this is we should have done it sooner. We should have gone immediately to the people that were in those positions and have conversations with them. And, my response in the moment, though, was, I can't say anything. That this is beyond the scope. This is all of these other factors. So from an emotional perspective, I was telling myself all of these things that why I couldn't do things. And that comes from a natural, we know from human behavior, right? Most people, this isn't everybody. And again, context matters, personalities matter, but in general, people don't like conflict. We are conflict avoidance people. We are status quo people. We like to mostly stay within some of these larger social norm guardrails, right? And so those are some pieces that happen. And the reality of it is that fear that I had about going and bringing up these kind of personal and touchy topics, the fear of what could happen, the uncertainty around it is much worse, much, much worse than the reality of actually, confronting those issues, bringing light to them, and then having a resolution happen. And I know that. This is the thing. I've known that for years. I've known that from the research. I've known it from past experience. And yet it still happens, right? And it happens, I think, to most people, unless you overcome it and done this enough. But it's the hesitancy. It's the fear of the unknown. It's the uncertain result and what you're going to do and how people are going to respond. And you ruminate over that, and the rumination, the fear of what could happen is much worse than anything that actually usually happens.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of interesting thought into that. And, here, one of your motivators in a way was fear, right? So one of the things that was moving you into action, or in this case, inaction, was actually fear, right? So there's many insights to that, and many, I don't know, I think it's very, very interesting. We usually talk about a lot about game design and gamification, but in game design and gamification, we're always talking about what it is that's motivating our players, right? And what's driving us to do or stop doing things. And in this case, I thought it was very, very interesting. So thank you for that story, Kurt. Thank you for opening up in that sense as well. So we like to talk about these failures as well to humanize our guests, right? Because we know you're doing fantastic work. That's why you're here. And we heard that in the intro, but you also like to humanize and see that, we've all been through difficult moments, and we will continue to be through those. But of course, we also like to shift. We like to shift as well to a situation where you would actually like to have one of those, maybe we can call them proud moments, right? One of those projects or clients, something that went, the way you wanted it, the first or the nth time, it doesn't matter. We want to be there with you and maybe, cling onto some of those success factors that you would attribute that success to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll backtrack just a little bit because, as you mentioned, you're game designers and this idea of humanizing things, and I think that's really true. And one of the insights I think that you can take out is there's this principle. It's called the G.I. Joe principle, which means that knowledge in and of itself isn't enough to drive behavior or action. And that was what applied to me there. I knew this cognitively. I knew that this fear was probably, worse in the uncertainty of it in foreshadow as opposed to in reality. Yet knowing that doesn't change my actual behaviors. And so I think thinking about that, and I think sometimes we too often go, if people know this, then they'll do Y, right? And we know that isn't the case. And so I think that's a insight from a game design perspective to keep in mind that even if your players know something, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to take action on it. There needs to be different motivators and different elements inside of that. Moving on to like positives, I'm going to actually shift. I'm going to shift to the podcast and just talk through, we've had just some of the best conversations, I think, with some leading academics who are renowned about this stuff. And so for me, I think the success that we've had is this idea of being able to have these conversations and gain just this wealth of information about why we do what we do, the understanding the human brain, understanding human motivation, understanding why we think and how we decide is just amazing. And I will go back to one of our earlier interviews with Annie Duke, who is an author. She wrote Thinking in Bets, and another book that was more recent was How to Decide. She's a decision thinker, but she had started off as a professional poker player, and she won a couple professional poker championships, millions of dollars in winnings. And then she took those lessons and brought them into decision making and all sorts of wonderful things about how you decide and make decisions. And obviously the title of her book, Thinking in Bets, right, brings back to that piece. But in that conversation with her, you talk about humanizing, right? This idea of like that you ask about the failure first and then you ask about the success. We were able, and Annie was on the podcast circuit and on the other things. So she'd done tons of these different things. But it was really interesting because we were able to build a relationship with Annie. And I think we try to do that with most of our guests. And it was because some of the background that we did. And so we did some background digging and we found out that her mentor, she had actually gone to try to get a PhD. She didn't finish it before she started her poker life, to do some backstory there. But her mentor, her sponsor on the PhD program was a woman by the name of Leah Gleitman, who is a famous linguistic. And so we just brought that up and it changed the tone. It changed the dynamic of the podcast. And to this day, we actually just were on a phone call with Annie just last week talking about the next book that she's going to write and just having a really good conversation and making that transaction more of a social transaction than just a, you're doing this to get on our podcast and we're doing this to have you on the podcast. And we both get some hopefully economic gain by selling more books for her and us getting more listeners,
It makes sense. And again, I'm sort of tracking back on this as well as on the previous question, because there's many behavioral insights there. Because, what happened, there are many things, I know there are many things in the back of our brains happening when you establish that relationship. But I would like you to share with the audience that sort of process. What happened there? How did you, what about bringing up something from that background made you be, sort of closer and getting her to open up and change her behavior, essentially?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I think part of this is just think about how relationships are built, right? We tend to, as much as we think we like opposites attract, we tend to actually like people that are more like us. That's in general, we find commonalities, we find these pieces. And we also like people who take an interest in us. And so there's a couple factors that are happening here. So one is that we obviously had done some background and took an interest in Annie beyond just the book that she was writing and those pieces, but trying to understand her and who she was and the story that she had. And when you do that, that makes people, you like it when somebody remembers your name. You like it when they remember small details about you. And if you've never met them before, it's just finding this commonality. We just interviewed Dessa, the rapper. I don't know if anybody, she's from Minneapolis. So that's, she's, but she is this rapper and she's a writer and she actually just started her own podcast. And so she came on ours and her podcast is actually on decision making and applying science into real world problems. And so it's really interesting. She's really a polymath person. But we talked to her about her songwriting and how she shares some, personal elements within that songwriting element of what she writes. Then we talked about her audience and she said, some people will come up and they feel like they have an instant connection because they know a little bit about me because I've shared like my heartbreaks and various different things through my songwriting. And she said, so they feel like this connection, which I don't necessarily have, although it isn't necessarily always a one-way street, because she goes, well, they'll say, that song you wrote is about heartbreak and I went through the same thing. And so all of a sudden you have this shared commonality. And I think that's what we did with Annie is we were talking about her mentor and linguist and this idea that we were interested in the same things that she was. And so we had this shared commonality. So long story, but I think that
no, absolutely, it makes sense. And we like to talk a lot about our players in this podcast and how they behave. So engagers remember all these conversations about how do people behave and so on. And when you're thinking of your players, if you get to use that sort of, and yes, I'm a little bit of a geek, the Alfred effect, the Alfred Pennyworth from Batman. He's personalizing, he's taking care of everything for Bruce Wayne so he can be Batman, right? Mm-hmm. So if you can do some of that for your players so that they only take care of what they have to do in your game, in the system that you're creating, well, you're taking care of them. You're showing that you care about them and their mission. And that way you get them to, be more open and more willing to participate in the system that you're creating, to enjoy it and to have fun as well. So I think there are many key lessons that we're taking away from here. So thank you again very much for the story, for going into the science as well, and understanding what is sort of behind the curtain, which is something that always interests us. And again, we've talked about success and failure, one with clients, another one in the podcast. I'm sure that when you're talking to clients and thinking of, changing behaviors and using communication for that, you probably follow some sort of steps, rules, process. Like we would like to be, in 5 minutes inside your mind when some client approaches you with a problem. How does that work? Like as generic as you can. How does that, do you have, or maybe it doesn't, maybe you don't have a process and it just works different every time. But we want to sort of be in your mind in that sense.
I wish I had a better process, right? Always wish I had a better process on that. A lot of this is bespoke. A lot of this is customized, various different pieces, but there are some models, right? So if we think about this from a behavioral science perspective, one model that I like that was developed first by the Behavioral Insights team over in England, which was one of the first kind of teams that was brought together, and they worked with the British government to apply behavioral science principles inside the government, and they came up with a whole bunch of really great ideas and experiments that they did. But one of the things that they talked about, they first had a framework that they called Mindspace. And Mindspace, it talked about messenger effect, incentives, and then, and it's too long for anybody to remember. And I can't even remember. So now I'm like, I know the first two and then I forget. So they actually simplified this model, and they said there's a different way. And they called EAST. And EAST is for easy, attractive, social, and timely. And I use that model. And again, I'm model agnostic mostly, but you're talking about a framework, and it's just a way of looking at a situation, and as you're thinking about trying to change the behavior of somebody. So whether that be through an incentive program, whether that be through communication, it doesn't matter. But I look and say, all right, so what are the friction points from keeping people from doing the desired behavior that you want? And how can we make that easier? How can we remove that friction point from them to make it easier for them to do behavior X? All right. How do we make it attractive? So and again, thinking about communication, oftentimes what we end up dealing with is people, particularly in work situations, they're sending out memos or instructions on, we do a lot of work with sales incentives and compensation plans, and they're 12, 15 page documents that are 12 point, just, Word document that, it has a lot of great information in it, but by page 4, it's boring and legal-esque, and most people have tuned out. And so how do you make it attractive? How do you get people to pay attention to it? How do you make sure that there's some pizzazz that draws their eye? It takes the pieces of information, and again, making it easy, right? So I don't have to read through a paragraph. I can see with one graphic what is going on here and what this is. Social. How do I get people to engage with each other? Making sure that the social norms are there, that this is a key piece of how people are motivated and how they change. Like, as much as we like to think about that lone cowboy out on the plane as this epitome of the, this manly man kind of thing, we're not built that way. We are social creatures. We look to others for that support. We look for others to give us what is the right thing to do. I mean, there's lots of great research on social norms. Robert Cialdini does this wonderful study of in hotels and rehanging up your towel.
Yeah.
Every place you go in and they say, help save the environment, hang your towel up and we won't wash it again. And just by putting up a note that says, hey, 87% of the people reuse their towels, you're showing the social norm. And the uptick of people actually reusing their towels, like putting them up and hanging them up and not having them go to the laundry, and don't quote me on this, but I think it raised it like 40 or 50%. So the increase of people actually doing it just from...
And it has a survival perspective as well. We have the same brains as we had, thousands of years ago.
Exactly.
Being in the tribe was surviving.
And that's actually really, really good. The evolutionary psychology part of this is that, look, we had to have the tribe in order to live. And so you want to make sure that you're doing things that are in line with the rest of the tribe. And there's lots of positives with that, but there can be also lots of negatives, which is a whole nother aspect of this. And the last thing is timely, right? Making sure that if you put an intervention in and it's 3 months, or a training and it's 3 months in advance of when some action is required, there's going to be a fall off. And so if you had just done that training a few days in advance, then you're much more likely to get that. And that comes in a number of different pieces. And again, I think you can probably translate a lot of this into some of the game design stuff that you guys talk about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Definitely. Yes. That is a complete yes. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. And Kurt, what would you say if you had to, from behavioral science, there's many nuggets we've been talking about, but would you say that there is some sort of best practice, something that you would say, well, when thinking of behavioral science, when using behavioral science for design or for whatever, it would be a good thing if you thought of, or if you implemented this or that. Of course, no silver bullets here, but something that probably would help in your projects at least.
Yeah. Oh, man. And there really aren't any silver bullets here. I think the one thing, and I do a lot of work with organizations, and the one thing that I talk about organizations, or talk to leadership within organizations, is just this concept. Again, it isn't necessarily behavior science, but it is this overarching piece that, hey, your employees are human beings who have a life beyond the work that they're doing. And I think maybe the same, insight. And I know you talked about humanizing different pieces, but this idea that the players, that the people who are playing your games are bigger and broader than just who they are when they're in the game and playing the game. And so part of that is trying to understand, what their life is like. And so, because that's going to impact a lot of how they react, a lot of how they're showing up inside of the game, what gets them excited, what kind of frustrates them, all of those factors. And I think too often we just get a myopic look and kind of look really close in at the area that we're working on, whether that be in an organization, that this is your role, this is the job that you need to do, and that's all I can care about. And maybe the same thing happens inside of game development. Like, this is the game, here's what we do this and do this, but we're not thinking about the players are actually human beings, and they have a life, they have families and friends and things outside of the game, and how does that impact what they're doing inside of the game?
Absolutely. In fact, there is, I don't know if you've heard of this before from Yu-Kai Chow, but he likes to say that there is two types of design in general. There's function-focused design. So it's focused on what you're creating. What does it do? So let's say you create a software that gets people to do their accounting or whatever, the bills and so on. You just put them there. And the software in that sense works perfectly for doing those expenses, those bills. However, if you do human-focused design, you're considering that, that there is a person who is going to use this software, and you have to think of, their motivations, their habits, and all these things. And it's something I'd like to talk about a lot. And I completely agree with you, because there is the function that you need them to get done as an employee, for example, as you were saying, but there's also a human behind that, function. They're not just a name. They're not just a function that does something. They have their own motivations, and it's not like, oh yeah, we pay them to do this thing, which you do in a way. But
yeah,
you have to see, what's behind it. Like, you want them to do it and to do it well and to give you the best of themselves. How do you help them get there? They're not getting paid for giving the best of themselves. They're paying, to depending on the organization, there's different varieties of this, right? But it is about seeing what is behind that, what is the human there, and how they're motivated to doing what they're doing. I love your answer.
And you bring up a really good point. Is in organizations, you can pay somebody and they can come and do the job. They're going to do the job. They're going to do it to a level that I'm not going to get fired for, maybe a little bit more, but am I getting all of that person's energy and creativity and potential, right? Not just what is minimally required. And there's lots of research that shows that if you can get people engaged and again, tap into that human side of things and recognize that person for who they are and understand that they're dealing with different things, they're going to be much more willing to give you that extra effort, that discretionary energy that they have, right? We are always kind of trying to conserve our energy from an evolutionary perspective in various different pieces, but you're more likely to give some of that to the organization, and you're going to have longer loyalty, that they're going to stay at the organization longer. And again, thinking about a game, right? You can have that functional. I love that idea of the functional versus the human side of this. You can have the best functions. It can work the best way, but if it's not engaging who they are or understanding how that fits into their overall life, they may have fun and play with it for a little while, but is it going to be something that is element that they're really is a part of who they are in their life? Probably not. And so you're not going to have that longevity of people playing that game for as long as they could.
Absolutely. And we've been talking for a good while, having great recommendations from you. You kind of had a vibe of the podcast, and you're a podcaster who interviews people regularly as well. So I think this question is particularly relevant for this moment. And it's all about if you think that there's anybody that, comes to your mind when I say, well, would you have somebody come to Professor Game as a guest, other, of course, than having you like after you? Is there somebody that comes to your mind, somebody that you would like to listen to? You would be maybe curious about listening to their answers in Professor Game podcast.
So I already mentioned her name. So Annie Duke, who again is a decision scientist. So she does some really great work on like, how do we make decisions? How are we, prioritizing what we make a decision on? What's the process for making those? How do we evaluate that in various different pieces? And I think, again, if you're thinking about the work that you're doing and who, that would be fascinating. Like how does that come into play in game design and all of the other factors that go along there? So
definitely sounds like a very interesting one. And interestingly, I had never heard of Amy before, but I think recently somebody recommended that exact same book from her. So
there you go.
She's kind of becoming a trend.
The universe is trying to tell you something. There you go.
Absolutely. And precisely talking about books, is there any book that you recommend this audience, the engagers? Of course, it doesn't have to be on game design or gamification, but something that you think would pique our minds as well in that sense. Yeah,
so there's, I could name off a bunch. I think probably one of the best books to get people kind of an overview of behavioral science, and a lot of behavioral science is about understanding human behavior that doesn't necessarily align with what classical economists would call rational decision making, right? So it's this idea that we will forego money if we feel that we're being not being treated fairly. There's a wonderful game called the Ultimatum Game where you got two players. One player gets $10, but he or she has to split that up somehow, and the other player gets to say they accept or they don't accept. If they don't accept, nobody gets any money. If they accept, they get it. An economist would say doesn't matter what player A makes the split. It could be $9, $1. It could be $9.99 to 1 penny. You're still better off, so you should always accept. It's not like you're going to deal with this person again. There's not ongoing pieces of this. But in reality, what ends up happening is, hey, people will often refuse. It usually takes about $3 or more in order for people to accept. And for some people, it's $5. They want an even split, or they're going to just reject it just out of spite and say, this doesn't seem fair, and we're going to do that. So again, that's not a rational economic thing. And so that's a lot of what behavioral science talks about. And there's a great book, and it's by Dan Ariely, and it's called Predictably Irrational. And so it's there. We have these irrational pieces, and when you compare it to some classical economic theory, and just everyday kind of pieces. If you said, look, would you turn down $2? And people, if it was given to you, you'd say no, but then you add on those extra layers and people will turn down that $2 because of different things. But what Dan Book does is he talks a lot about some of the theory and the great stories inside of it. So it's a wonderful book and a great intro to behavioral science.
Absolutely. Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational. Fantastic book, definitely. And, when we're talking about behavioral science, I'm sure, we were talking in the pre-interview chat that there's been others like Nir Eyal in the podcast. And then, there'll be different answers. And that's definitely the case because you're different people, right? Mm-hmm. So in that case, you have, I'm sure, some unique abilities in that sense. And you probably have something that you would like to call, or we would like to call, your superpower. That thing that splits you from at least most people. Of course, we're not 100% unique in our superpowers. I like to talk about Thor being able to fly, but then you have Iron Man who can fly too as well. They can both fly, but they're different, right? Yeah. So what would you say is that thing, that sweet spot that you have in behavioral science?
Man, I hate these questions. It's like, would you rather be invisible or fly or whatever that is? I don't, No, I think there's some things. I think one of the things that I bring to the table, maybe not more so than others, but at least it's my part that I think is one of the things that I add value with, is just the larger picture thinking. So, and particularly as we're thinking through like working with organizations, particularly as if you think about incentives or motivation or engagement, and companies put in these programs, they put in these this incentive plan here or this recognition program over here. And what they often don't take notice of is the unintended consequences. So what if this is designed to drive X, but what are some of the underlying elements within that people either going to quote unquote game the system, right? And or if they do X, did we think 3 levels down to say, well, wow, maybe X wasn't the right thing for them to do? So it's taking that larger picture and looking across the board and saying, how is this going to impact the entire system? More of a holistic approach than just a specific approach. So there, Mr. Holistic Man. I don't know what the name my super name would be.
So, Kurt, I think I just not to go down fully into the rabbit hole, but there is an interesting discussion that we typically have about leaderboards, right? So leaderboards in competition. So I actually just finished teaching a class, right? And one of the things that they brought up was, they were thinking of their system and they said, we put it in competition, but it was about health and well-being. So it's like, where does competition fit in here? It doesn't always fit, right?
Yeah.
And the unintended consequences of that is maybe people are motivated by this competition, but motivated to do the things you want, but maybe also some things that you don't want, right?
Exactly.
Just gaming the system, for example, is definitely one of them. Or, some people might be looking to be at the top position in a sales organization, but what about those guys who are at the bottom 10%? Are they ever going to be motivated by looking at a leaderboard and saying, I am at the bottom, or actually at the top of the worst, side of the organization? That's not engaging. That's not interesting for them.
It's not engaging at all, right? There's and actually it's usually probably people outside of the top 70% if it's just the top 10, right? Because after a certain point, you can't do that. The other thing, like in a leaderboard perspective, one of the unintended consequences is, hey, if the organization is really looking for teamwork and sharing ideas and best practices,
that's not there.
I've interviewed people who are saying, I don't share any of that stuff because I'm competing against Joe in the next,
it's my
territory.
Secret.
And I have the secret sauce. I'm not going to share that because then Joe's going to do better than me or Melissa down the road. And I don't want to, that's the unintended consequence. And so you have to understand what some of those are. You can motivate those top 10%, 20%, 30%, but you're leaving 70% behind and you're creating behaviors that may be contrary to the organization's overall success. So those are factors that come into play all the time when you think about that.
Absolutely. And I know you're not a gamer, but I would like to know if you have a favorite game that you could name today.
Oh man. My son plays CSGO and is just addicted to it. I've tried to get into it, and I'm not that good. My games from that perspective are more old fashioned. So I play chess, and I play online chess way too much. So if you go back to just your everyday thing. So, but I do like more of the games that are on your phone that are that distraction when you just go, I need a 10-minute break, and I need something that is just going to challenge me to the point that, all right, it's not so easy that I can just do it over and over again, but it's not so involved that I have to, study and learn and do all of these things. So I had played Fishdom for a while until I found out that I was actually probably playing it way too much. And so I took it off my phone. But those types of games, Tetris and other things like that. So
cool. Those are very good games as well. Definitely. And Kurt, before we let you go, we want to know if you have, of course, any final piece of advice, any final words you want to have, where we can find more about you, Behavioral Grooves, your consulting as well, where we can find more about Kurt, wherever you want to lead us. This is the CTA time, as well as if you have any final message.
Yeah. So I think the message is really this, is that humans act in ways that aren't always the ones that we would predict. And if we can understand those, because again, as Dan in his book, we're predictably irrational. And so understanding that can help us really do good things. And particularly if you're thinking about, game design and various different pieces, understanding that, well, if we do X, we think it'll lead to Y, but that's not how people think or how they behave. And actually, if you do X, it'll lead to Z. Well, if that's what you want, if you want to get to Z, great. But if you want to get to Y, then let's think about something else. So understanding that people are complex, they're crazy, and that we have all these biases and various different pieces that go into it. If you're at all interested in behavioral science, I encourage you, you can listen to the podcast. It's Tim and me. We have fun. We try to laugh a lot. It's called Behavioral Grooves. You can get it pretty much on any pod service, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or anything like that. And then, again, probably the easiest way to reach me is on my Twitter, and that's at What Motivates. So, and that's it. Thank you. That's cool. That's great to know. Thanks for that final piece of advice. Definitely, you've been dropping value bombs, as a podcaster I know loves to say. I think many things have been said, many interesting insights that we can take and drive them home to our daily work. However, at least, and after thanking you, of course, once again for being today with us and investing this time in the Engagers, we now have to say, however, that it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. And if you want more interviews with incredible guests like Kurt, all you have to do is please go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started on our email list for free. That way we'll be in contact. You'll know of opportunities. You'll know of updates that we have on Professor Game. And of course, before you go on to your next mission, remember to subscribe or follow, which is also for free, using your favorite podcast app so that you can listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.